A couple of weeks ago we looked at Jesus telling people to turn the other cheek. And we talked about how when we see that, we just know Jesus didn't mean that. It's got to have some kind of interpretation to it. And we say, well, that's what he said, but let me tell you what he meant. And we looked at 14 different interpretations that people have come up with for turn the other cheek. There are actually more than the 14 we looked at. Those are just the popular ones. Today I want us to look at something else Jesus said it might be disturbing. We heard it from our gospel reading. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. Now that comes straight from the mouth of Jesus. And of all the things Jesus said, I do not know why, but that's one of the things that for many, many, many years has stuck in my mind. You know, you just think of all the things Jesus said. I mean, we need to pay attention to all of it, but for some reason, that's something that has stuck in my mind. And it's something that I've wondered about. I wonder what to do with it. Now, when I think of that verse, I can't help but go back, first of all, to my second semester of seminary. And it was a class on the Gospel of Mark. And there was something in there I couldn't understand. So you could go to the professor's office, and ask him. So I went in there and asked him, what does this passage mean? He said, well, what does it say? And I said, well, it says this. He said, well, I assume that's what it means. And I said, what? And he said, well, you first assume that it means what it says. And then he said, what you do with it is between you and God. And that's another thing I remembered. Of all the things I heard through 4 years of seminary, that's one of the things I remembered. Assume it means what it says, but what you do with it is between you and God. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to look at woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. I guess we have to go with what Jesus said there. Woe to you when all people speak well of you. Because that's what people do to false prophets. Think about that for a minute. Now, when we look at something in the Bible, the first thing we need to be cautious about is that we don't add things that aren't there. And I've heard a lot of people talk about this passage, and they add there, when Jesus said, woe to you when all people speak well of you, they add the word evil in front of people. They say, well, that really means woe to you when all evil people speak well of you. That's what they tell us it means. You may have seen that before. But Jesus didn't say that. At least if he did, it's not recorded in the Bible. You read a lot of stuff like that. What Jesus meant was, woe to you when evil people speak well of you. That's what Jesus really meant. But the word evil's not in there. And so we can't add it. And we can't assume it's there. It doesn't matter who tells us it should be in there. No matter who tells you. That's what Jesus meant. It's not in there. You see, doing stuff like that with the Bible is how people get in trouble. Another way they get in trouble is rearranging stuff. And I've seen people do that with this verse. They sort of rearrange it and they say, well, what Jesus means there is that you will know you're doing God's will when people speak badly of you and when you cause controversy and when people don't like you. Then you'll know you're doing God's will. So if you're causing controversy, when people are talking bad about you and people don't like you, you'll know you're doing God's will. But that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. You see, you have to be very cautious and stick just with what it says and not twist it and come up with something different. Now, another thing that we always do when we see something in the Bible that's difficult is we look at it in its context. And the context of this verse is in Luke version of what we call the Beatitudes. The one we're most familiar with is the one from Matthew. That's how Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount. But Luke also has a set of Beatitudes. And in Luke, these are the people whom Jesus says are blessed. The poor. Blessed are those who hunger, those who weep, and those who people hate. Now, in Luke's version of the Beatitudes, Jesus goes on to give a list of what might be called anti-beatitudes. And these start with not blessed are, but woe to. And these are almost the opposite of the ones he said are blessed. He says, woe to those who are rich, to those who are full, to those who laugh, and woe to you when all people speak well of you. So that's the context this comes in. It comes in, blessed are these people, and woe to these people. Now, following this, the context is that Jesus tells us, among other things, to love our enemies. Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. Jesus tells us that God is kind to the unthankful and the evil. Jesus tells us not to judge people. And Jesus tells us that the blind cannot lead the blind. So the context of this, woe to you when all people speak well of you, is that it is in a large body of Jesus' teachings that are very difficult for us to understand and that go against the way most people live. That's the context of this. Now, when we look at the passage a little deeper, it's first helpful to look at the word blessed. In some Bibles and modern translations, it's translated as happy. But if you go to classical Greek, you see this word used a lot. It designates satisfaction because you are experiencing fullness. You are satisfied because you are full. And there's another word that is the opposite of that, and that is the word that means to be in want, to be needy, to not have. So the word that is translated as blessed is the opposite of being in want, the opposite of being in need, the opposite of being destitute. It means to be satisfied because you are full. You are not in a state of want. You don't need anything. You have plenty. You have all you need. You're satisfied because your needs are fulfilled. Now let's look at the word that's translated as woe. That literally means grief in the sense of grieving a loss. You are experiencing distress and anguish because you have experienced a loss. And now we can go back and see more what Jesus is saying. Those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who are crying, and those who are hating are the ones who are satisfied. The ones whose wants are satisfied. The ones whose needs are satisfied. The ones who are rich, the ones who are full, the ones who are laughing, and the one all people speak well of are the ones in mental anguish and distress. How does that make sense? Aren't the ones who are rich and full and laughing and the people who everyone speaks well of, aren't they the ones who are satisfied and have no wants or needs? And if they're not, and there's something wrong with them and they should be? And aren't the ones who are poor and hungry and crying, and about whom people speak bad of, aren't they the ones that are full of mental anguish and distress? And if they're not, they should be. But we have Jesus saying just the opposite. According to Jesus, it's those who are rich and full and laughing and everybody speaks well of who are in mental anguish and distress. And it is the poor, the hungry, the crying, and those people speak bad of who are actually satisfied and have no wants or needs. How could he have really meant that? How could he have really meant that? How in the world could you be satisfied? How could you say you have no wants or needs if you are poor and hungry and crying and everybody's talking bad about you? Isn't that the very definition of having wants and needs? When you're poor, hungry, crying, and everybody talks bad about you. And how in the world could we think of the rich, the full, the laughing, and all those who people speak well of as being in mental anguish and distress? Well, I figured it out. I know what Jesus meant here. Jesus is talking about the evil rich, those who have gotten rich by scamming people, getting their money in some dishonest way. We all know them. They're the ones around who used to loan people $500 on 1,000 acres of land, and if they miss one payment, they take the whole 500 acres. It's people around here that used to do that and got rich off of it. Or they're the ones that make people work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in a factory for 50 cents an hour and live in poverty. There's people around here that used to do that, you know. A lot of people got rich off that. Those are the people that Jesus is talking about. And you see, those people fool everybody into thinking they're respectable. But in their minds, they knew they were not. In their minds, they were in mental anguish and distress because they knew what they were. They got up every morning and they looked in the mirror and they knew what they were. They knew. And you know, they lived their lives afraid they would be exposed for what they really are. Those were the people Jesus is talking about. And what Jesus was telling us here, you know, if that's the only way you can get your money, you're better off being poor, you're better off being hungry, you're better off crying, and you're better off nobody liking you. So the woes apply to those people that got it dishonest by taking advantage of people. They're con artists, they know it, they're evil, they know it, they see it every morning when they look in the mirror, and it eats on them and eats on them and eats on them until they can't stand it. Now, I wove quite a tale there, didn't I? And I bet it sounded reasonable, didn't it? Probably didn't sound much different than stuff you've heard preachers say before. The problem with that was, though, that Jesus never said that. I got that by twisting what he said, rationalizing it, and coming up with something that suited me. See, I did with rich exactly what a lot of people do with all people. A lot of people put, well, Jesus meant all evil people, and I put all evil rich. You see, I added something to it. And I got an interpretation that sounded very reasonable. And chances are you've heard that before. But I did violence to the biblical text. If I had just stayed with what Jesus said, I could not have gone down that road and tried to rationalize it out that Jesus was just talking woes toward certain dishonest rich, because he never said any such thing. I put those words in his mouth. If I had just stayed with what Jesus said, I could never have gone down that road, weaving that yarn that sounded so reasonable, so reasonable. Does anybody in here want to be poor and hungry and crying and have everybody speak bad about you? I don't we all want to be rich or relatively so? Don't we all want to be full, laughing, and have people speak good about us? Don't we? Do we? Isn't that the good life we strive for? Aren't those the standards by which we measure success in life? Think about it. Isn't that the life you wanted for your children? But look at what Jesus said about that. You see why it's so hard to read the Gospels with that assumption that Jesus meant what he said? See why it's hard to do that? Because when we just take one of them and follow it out, see where we get. That's the reason the religion of Christianity is based primarily not on the teachings of Jesus, but on the writings of the Apostle Paul. That's the reason. Now, for several years, and I don't remember when we started doing it, Wanda and I started reading aloud at least a chapter, sometimes two, of the Bible every evening. When we get through in the evenings and get the dishes washed and the kitchen cleaned up, the trash put out, and all this happening, and get everything settled, that's the only time we don't use our living room except at night after supper. We go in there and sit, and Wanda usually looks at her tablet or scans the TV, and I'll sit there and study stuff. But we go into the living room every night after we get everything else done, and we decided that first thing we'd do in the evening was start reading a chapter or two from the Bible. We started with the New Testament. Actually, that was our intention to do the New Testament. And we wanted to look at the Gospels, so we started reading the Gospels, a chapter or two a night, and we read them over and over. And we did this, it had to be for over a year, just the Gospels. And then we decided to read some of the other books of the New Testament. And we started that a chapter a night, aloud. And then we got through the other books of the New Testament a couple of times, and we went back to the Gospels, and we went over here, and then we started skipping around to different books and all. And we've done this for several years. And so one of the things that, after reading the Gospel every night for over a year from the different Gospels, and then when we started in the rest of the New Testament, the writings of Paul, I'm thinking, this is a different religion. I know it doesn't seem that way the way most people study the Bible, because the way most people study the Bible is we look at like maybe a little short verse from the Old Testament, one from the Gospels, and one from a little 2 or 3 lines from the New, and we imagine that it's all the same thing, all goes together. But if you read the Gospels and just stay there for a long period of time, to where you just get used to that and really get into that, and then you go to the rest of the New Testament, it's a little different. Well, it's more than a little different. So that's when it became clear to me that organized Christianity is based on the writings of the Apostle Paul instead of the teachings of Jesus. Now, of course, there's some things in organized Christianity that come from the teachings of Jesus, but they're snippets. They're the things we can follow that don't cause us too much trouble. You know, we sort of like that one where Jesus said, "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone." You know, we sort of like that one, so that one's okay. So we go through and we cut out the things that don't make us too uncomfortable. And of course, we use the crucifixion and all, and give a passing nod to the resurrection every Easter, but mostly it's the crucifixion. But most of the other stuff about organized Christianity comes from the writings of Paul. You know, that reading the Bible like that is one of the best things I've ever done. And I've studied the Bible a lot in my life, but I have never studied it in that manner. And that really caused me to see how we have really neglected the plain teachings of Jesus. And when I say plain, I mean things that he said straight out, that's right there, come straight out of his mouth that he said. We've tended to pick out those that are not too harmful and too disturbing. We have tended to pick out those which are innocuous and don't make us very uncomfortable. The ones that hit us where we hurt. Well, he didn't mean that, you couldn't. Now I want to go back to what my seminary professor said. Remember, he said when you read something in the Bible, first you assume it means exactly what it says. And then he said, what you do with it from there is between you and God. And that's the way I want to leave it. Jesus said, those who are poor and hungry and crying, and of whom all people speak badly, are satisfied and have all they want and need. Jesus said those who are rich and full and laughing, and of whom all people speak well, are those who are in mental anguish and distress. And he didn't insert any qualifiers in there. He didn't say all righteous people who are poor and hungry and crying, and of whom people speak badly, are satisfied and have all they need. And he didn't say all evil people who are rich and full and laughing, and whose people speak well of are in mental anguish. He didn't put any qualifiers in front of those, you see. So this week I'd like to challenge you to think about that. He didn't put any qualifiers in front of that. If we want to assume he meant what he said, that is between each one of us and God.